Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Take the Meat, Spit Out the Bones. I am your favorite doctor of education, back with another education research video. Today, we are going to be focused on more students with disabilities, but then some statistics nationally about them, their graduation rates. We're going to be looking at their makeup, racial ethnic makeup in SPED, how many percentages per state have students with disabilities. So we're going to be discussing many different things about students with disabilities. All right, so I'm going to just share my screen really quickly and we'll get started. Okay, so this information comes from the National Center for Education Statistics. We're going to be discussing students with disabilities, like I told you. So something very important to understand, COVID did a lot, change a lot of the dynamics of education, probably for many years to come, right? So a lot of students with disabilities, actually the rates increased after COVID. So this information, yes, it comes from the National Center for Education Statistics, but they gleaned the information from the IDEA document, right? So they're reporting it on their platform, but the information is from IDEA. Okay, so during the COVID pandemic, the total public school enrollment decreased by 3%. That is so interesting because where did the children go? Okay, so many people have many discussions about where the children went, but that's very important for us to talk about. But then also, did they come back? All right, so that's where did they go and did they end up coming back? And if they didn't come back, who's looking for them? Okay, but anyway, so in the fall 2022 enrollment remains lower than it was in fall 2019 before the pandemic. Meanwhile, the number of students served under IDEA decreased by 1% between 2019 and 2020, and 2020 and 2021. In 2022 to 2023, the number of students served under IDEA reached an all-time high of 7.5 million. So that's really an all-time high. So that's something just to think about. During COVID, why do we have such an increase after COVID? So were more disabilities created because of COVID, or people were then seeing a lot of students not meeting grade level benchmarks, and now they're being identified with a disability. Maybe that's an overrepresentation. Maybe they shouldn't be identified with a disability. So these are some things to think about. So let's look at this map. So this map shows the percentages of public school enrollment by state and jurisdiction. All right, so the World Health Organization says that any country's population has around 15% with disabilities. So if you notice, you'll see that range in the different states in America. So you'll see that range in different states. So say, for instance, Wyoming, you have 18. So the US average is 15, according to, similar to World Health Organization patterns. But then you'll see some states being a lot more, which is a cause for alarm as well, right? So some states may be underreporting. Texas may be underreporting. They've been cited for underreporting students with disabilities, and some states may be overreporting as well. So let's just think about that, because if you notice, Pennsylvania has 21% of their population, their student population are served under IDEA, which means they're in special education, and New York and Maine. So that's an overrepresentation with the average. And then Idaho and Miami are under. But here, look at Puerto Rico. Wow, please write down in the chat, why do you think Puerto Rico has 37% of their students served under IDEA? That is a lot of students. Yeah, that's a really high number. That's double the world average of students that should be served under IDEA if we're looking at 15%, and more than double the US average. So that's something just to think about. Also, something similar to what I had mentioned in a disproportionality video, 15% of students in the Bureau of Indian Education schools are served under IDEA. So remember that I made a point that the indigenous population, they're grotesquely overrepresented, but they're more overrepresented where you see a lower number of them. So with Indian in education schools, the majority of students, right, are most likely Indians, or rather indigenous people. So you don't see an overrepresentation of them because they're around the 15% where they should be, the average. But if if you're in a school district where, they're only 1% of the student body, but they make up 20% of the students with disabilities, that's where you see the overrepresentation happening, where they have lower numbers in a school district. So let's look at this. So these are the percentages of disability types, and we kind of went over this in another video, but this is how the breakdown goes. So we have around 13 disability types. So SLD is the majority, is 32%, SLI 19, then other health impairment, autism, and thereafter. So another really big thing to think about, like I was telling you in another video about disproportionality. So like I just mentioned, indigenous people are overrepresented in this country. So if you look at the American Indian Alaska Native, they make up 19% of the students served under IDEA. But if you look at the numbers this is a visualization of America's population. So these percentages may be off just a percent or two. So if you look at here, the American Indian Alaska Native, they only make up 0.7% of the US population, but they make up, like I said before, 19% of the disability rates, right? So Asians are also overrepresented. Remember, in another video, we talked about how they're overrepresented in autism. So this is where that number comes in. So they're overrepresented because Asians in this country, they only make up 5.6% of the population, but they're 8% of the students with disabilities. Why? Because of that autism. They have a high rate of autism. I think approximately a third of students who are Asian, who have a disability, have autism. So we know Blacks are definitely overrepresented, Pacific Islander are overrepresented, Hispanic are kind of lower, but a little overrepresented in different disability types, and whites are underrepresented, definitely, because they're 16%, only 16% of the students with disabilities. But if you look at this number, the population of the country, they're 60%. So they're grotesquely underrepresented. Why do you think so? Please write down in the chat. All right, and in the comments, rather. Okay, so another thing that we have to think about is who is actually included. Which students with disabilities are included in general education classrooms? Because one of the goals of IDEA and really in special education in general is to try to acclimate students in the more so-called general population, students with disabilities, right? You want them to be more in general education classrooms, exposed to their so-called non-disabled peers or peers without a disability. So let's see who is actually included and what the percentages are. So if you notice what is reported by 2020, around 67% of students with disabilities spend 80% or more of their school day in general ed classes. So that's a good number, but still, it's really not, obviously it's not 100%. So which means they're segregated in the back hallway, the basement, the trailer outside the building, or separate schools where they're not even in proximity to any of their peers without a disability, right? So, but there are specific disability types who are more included than others. So we're going to look at that in a minute. So, so 40 to 79% are only in, sorry, let's see, 80%. So they only 16% spend 40 to 79% of the school day in general ed classes. So this may mean they probably have one or two inclusive classrooms, so-called inclusive, or like special classes like art, music, gym. And then 13% spend less than 40% of the school day in general classes, which means they may be in regular schools, but they're in special classes where they're only around students with disabilities the majority of the day, and they're only included oftentimes one period a day. Okay, so let's look at some of these disability types. So who are most likely to be included? Students with SLI, SLD, OHI, developmental delays. Remember, developmental delays, that's only up to age 8. So after that, they have to be exited out of special ed or get a new disability type. So this is only up to age 8 and visual impairment. But the ones who, and so a lot of these are a bit of the soft disabilities like SLI, SLD, somewhat OHI. Those are some of the soft disabilities. Whereas less than 1/3 of students with the following disabilities spend 80% or more of their time during the school day in general classes. So these are the ones who are least included, the multiple disabilities. Only 16% of them are actually included 80% or more in general classes. And ID 21% and deaf-blindness 31%. So these are the more segregated disability types. So which is another, this is probably the most profound education statistics that you're going to probably see when it comes to special ed. What are the outcomes of children? So this is just talking about if they graduate, graduation rates. But the thing is that we have to also look at after graduation, if they don't graduate, what ends up happening to these students. So in subsequent videos, we'll be talking about that. So let's look at the graduation rates of students with disabilities. Only 74% graduate. Let me just tell you again, these are all national numbers. So when you go into state, local areas, the numbers may look very different. So I've worked in school districts where the graduation rate was 30%, right? So 30% of students with disabilities graduated. Whereas here, the national number is 74%, but 15% of them drop out, right? 10% receive an alternative certificate, which is the biggest one of the biggest controversial elements of special education, because a lot of kids may get this alternative degree, but the alternative degree sometimes do not amount for very advantageous outcomes in the future, because can they go to college with this alternative degree? Can they get a very well-paying job with this alternative degree, right? So that's something to think about. So probably around 26% of them, a quarter of the students won't graduate or won't be seen, or their degree won't be seen as just as good as a person who's graduating with a regular diploma, right? So, but let's look at the racial statistics. So if you notice here, who's more likely, which racial ethnic group is most likely to graduate with a high school diploma? You see Asians, then I think the white population, and then, the lowest rates will be Black, right? So these are some statistics that you need to be aware of, especially if you're parents listening to this, thinking about putting your child into special education, or, just if you're researchers or if you're teachers studying education. These are some things that you need to look out for, and you need to keep abreast, because the more you know statistics, the better you off to choose, make hard decisions about your employment, your children. And also, these are just really important things to just keep abreast of, because we want to know, is the system working, right? If the system is not working, what do we need to change it? We need some major reform to change why these students are dropping out so early, why these students are not being included in general education classrooms, right? So these are some things that we need to think about. Okay, thank you so much for your time. Please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you for the next